Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to ECCN's webcast on affordable non-state schools. My name is Cornelia Janke and I am the Director of the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, or ECCN. The research that forms the subject of this webcast was completed for USAID by Results for Development through support from ECCN. And before we dive into the topic, I wanted to share a few words about ECCN for those of you who may not be familiar with us. ECCN is a USAID-supported network that targets USAID staff and partners in particular. We aim to improve the quality of USAID education programming in crisis and conflict-affected areas. You could think of us as a targeted sub-community within the larger EICC community. ECCN has four priority areas: safe learning environments, improved programming, local institutional capacity development, and improved equity. And this webcast is part of the equity priority area. We have a number of additional upcoming webcasts, products, and events that you may be interested in. And a few that I wanted to highlight are first, a policy-focused roundtable in Washington, D.C. on the 1st of June on developing recommendations for social-emotional learning in crisis-affected contexts. Discussions from this roundtable will inform the U.S. government's policy priorities and implementation guidance on how to best improve SEL outcomes for children in crisis. And while that, even if you're not able to attend that meeting, we will post a digest of proceedings on our website as well. On June 12th, we'll host a webcast that will present an EDC case study of the challenges and promising approaches for implementing an accelerated education program in an active conflict zone in northern Mali. In particular, this webcast will review the relevance of the AEWG Accelerated Education Guidance for accelerated education programs in active conflict contexts. And jumping to the week of November 12th, ECCN and the Accelerated Education Working Group, or AEWG, will offer a 3-day training in applying AEWG's Accelerated Education Guidance. This will take place in Kampala in Uganda, and we're busy organizing it, and we will share more information soon. You may also be interested in having a look at USAID's new learning agenda for education in crisis and conflict. It's available on ECCN's website. And finally, we have a number of publications that may be of interest to you. On the screen, you see images of our Safe Learning Environments Qualitative Assessment Tool, which is downloadable. Our Rapid Education and Risk Analysis Tool, also downloadable. And finally, the research report on affordable non-state schools, which is the subject of our presentation today. To find out more about any of these items, plus a whole lot more, I encourage you to visit ECCN's website at eccnetwork.net. And now for the webcast. So Nina Papadopoulos, the USAID team lead for education in crisis and conflict, will begin with an overview of the study. Next, Robert Francis and Arjun Upadhyay, both from R4D, will present key findings from case studies in El Salvador and Nigeria. Next, Nick Burnett, also representing R4D, will provide a summary and discuss a bit the implications of these findings. And finally, Suezan Lee, Education Finance Specialist at USAID, will share some next steps and also facilitate questions and answers. So with that, Nina, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here this morning with you. My name is Nina Papadopoulos, and as Cornelia said, I'm team lead for education crisis and conflict at USAID. Worldwide, more than 75 million crisis-affected children and youth are in need of education. More than a quarter of these children are not in school. Although there are many reasons why, one of the most significant is the absence of learning spaces and instructors to accommodate the high demand for education. Opportunities for children and youth to attend school are often hampered by the limited public resources to cater for infrastructure or teacher salaries. These limited resources are further strained in contexts coping with additional displacement and instability. In many crisis and conflict affected contexts, government-run education systems are either non-existent, fragmented, or broken, providing fertile ground for the proliferation of non-state schools that meet the high demand for education and provide opportunities to meet the shortfall in public supply. In places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Haiti, upwards of 90% of the education system is composed of non-state education provision. While these schools, often driven by the community, can provide a safe learning environment and assist children and society to return to normalcy, the instability of the context can make it difficult for them to provide a safe, quality education. In 2011, USAID commissioned a 6-country study to assess the growth trends and needs of the private primary and secondary school sector, surfacing important debates surrounding the non-government schools and providing recommendations on approaches national and international public agencies could take regarding this sector. The study concluded that in order to achieve education for all goals, instead of ignoring them, governments and donors needed to seriously engage and further capitalize on the growing number of non-state schools. USAID's 2011 education strategy prioritizes increased equitable access to education for crisis and conflict affected children and youth. Toward that end, USAID built on the 2011 study by engaging in a deeper exploration and analysis of the role that affordable non-state schools, which we also call ANSS for short, can play in filling this important gap in these complex contexts. Moreover, while there is growing research exploring both non-state education provision and more generally education in crisis and conflict, little investigation exists on the intersection of these two areas. USAID, partnering with ECCN and Results for Development, carried out this study examining the role of affordable non-state education providers in crisis and conflict settings, with a focus on primary and secondary schooling. The objectives of this presentation are to present findings from 2 case studies that emerged from this bigger study, El Salvador and Kaduna State in Nigeria, and to explore how governments and donors could support the affordable non-state education sector in crisis and conflict contexts. The country case studies are meant to answer 3 main questions. First, what does the non-state education sector look like in these contexts? This involved identifying primary actors, including the various types of non-state education providers in the formal and non-formal sectors, as well as organizations such as donors, NGOs, and non-state school support organizations that interact with non-state education providers. Second question that we were trying to answer is, what are the features of these affordable non-state schools with relation to quality, financing, access, and accountability, as well as the relationship between non-state schools and conflict and crisis? And finally, we really wanted to pull out what are some key recommendations for how governments and donors might productively engage with affordable non-state schools in these complex contexts. So now I'd like to hand this over to Arjun Upadi from R4D, who will talk more about the methodology of our study. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nina. So I'm Arjun Upadhyay. I'm a program officer here at Results for Development, and I'll be kicking off by presenting our research methods for El Salvador and Kaduna State. So our methods included a thorough literature review of various documents from journals, development agencies' reports, government reports, academic articles, and grade literature. Data was collected in-country over a period of 10 to 14 days through school visits and key informant interviews. The research team also developed and used a conceptual framework which was used to organize our findings and approach to data collection and analysis. Embedded in our analysis and approach was the use of a conflict-sensitive lens. So with that, I'll hand it over to Robert Francis, my colleague, to go over findings from El Salvador.
Great. Thanks so much, Arjun. El Salvador was selected as one of the case studies for this report, primarily because of its context of pervasive gang conflict, which reaches both urban and rural settings throughout the country. El Salvador is located in a region with extraordinarily high levels of violence, which is largely driven by gang conflict. And even within the region, El Salvador stands out as homicides peaked at 102 per 100,000 in 2015, which was the highest in the world in homicide rates that year. Gang identity, as well as the activities and impacts of gangs, are closely tied to territorial control. Gang members see themselves as having authority over their neighborhoods and its residents, including schools and the students that attend them. Residents in gang-controlled areas are subjected to harassment, threats of violence, extortion, and controls over freedom of movement. Youth, especially male youth, are threatened as they're seen as potential recruits. They're also suspected by police as belonging to gangs. Other gangs also suspect male youth of belonging to rival gangs. So these people can't safely cross gang boundaries, including to reach schools. Gang activity is pervasive throughout the country, and schools aren't spared the negative effects. About 63% of schools reported having gangs active in their communities, while over a quarter of schools reported having their internal security compromised by gangs. And over the last 5 years, hundreds of students and dozens of teachers have been killed by these gangs as well. In schools affected by gangs, students face bullying, assaults, and sexual violence, and teachers also lose authority and face the same threats of violence and assault. Students and teachers are sometimes unable to reach a school without crossing gang lines, and some students drop out of school rather than risk entering another gang's territory and risk their lives in the process. Following violent incidents, parents will also sometimes temporarily withdraw their children from school and later re-enrolling them. In response to these threats, households may try to relocate to less violent neighborhoods or send their children to different schools, which both mean disrupting education. Parents may pay for private transportation to take their children to school rather than risk walking or taking public transportation, or they may accompany their kids to school, although these options may not be available to low-income families. Finally, parents may choose to withdraw their children from school altogether. And another option that many parents choose is to send their children to non-state schools. So this case study involved a landscape analysis of the affordable non-state sector. Non-state schools account for about 21% of all enrollment in basic education. And these schools are concentrated in urban areas and are comprised of two school types. And the first type of these schools are fully private schools. Can we get the next slide? About 16% of all enrollment in basic education in El Salvador is in private schools, although in some high conflict urban areas, they account for about 30 to 60% of enrollment. So these schools may be owned by individuals, associations, businesses, churches, or other congregations, and they're fully or largely funded by school fees, which may range from $1 to over $100 per month, although about 60% of these schools charge less than $30 per month. And the greatest concentration of schools charge between about $15 and $30 per month. Teachers who teach in these schools are frequently paid minimum wage, and they're generally much younger than those in public schools. They often work in private schools while they wait for a higher paid position in a government school to open up. Finally, private schools, especially those in violence-affected areas, have little interaction with the government beyond a periodic accreditation. We found that the government didn't have up-to-date information on several schools we tried to contact. These schools don't receive any systematic support from the Ministry of Education. The second widespread type of non-state schools is the Catholic Education School Council, or Consejo Educativo Católico Escolar, or CESE for short. These schools account for about 5% of enrollment throughout the country, and they're likewise concentrated in urban areas. They're schools that are owned by Catholic parishes, dioceses, or congregations, and most, but not all, Catholic primary schools belong to this organization. These schools receive limited oversight from the Salvadorian Ministry of Education, and they're also the only non-state schools that receive Ministry of Education support. And that's based on the idea that these schools have a social mission and they serve marginalized students. It's also based on the fact that Catholic schools have a long relationship dating back to the 60s with the Ministry of Education. These schools also receive a per-student subsidy, which they also receive roughly half of the teacher salaries are paid by the Ministry of Education. And students attending these schools receive the same free books, uniforms, shoes, and food that students in public schools also receive for free. While most CESE schools also charge fees, the fees are low, below $25 a month, frequently below $12 a month. And with this background on the two primary types of non-state schools, I would like to move to present some of the case studies findings. First, we found that across the board, NGOs and government actors and donors believe that non-state schools almost exclusively serve middle and upper income populations. These actors were unaware of a low-fee private school sector. They also assumed that these schools are profitable and profit-driven. While schools fitting this description certainly exist in the country, they're not representative of many of the affordable non-state schools that serve marginalized groups. And because these donors have this assumption, affordable non-state schools generally don't access NGO, donor, or government services. And the ones that do access those services are generally those that are proactive in seeking them out. Second, we found that stringent infrastructure requirements, which are necessary to receive accreditation, make the process of opening a new private school very costly, meaning that very few new schools enter the market, usually just about 2 or 3 per year, compared to about 10 that close on average every year, meaning that the rate of opening new schools is well below replacement. The schools that do enter the market are generally larger and charge higher fees in order to recoup the cost of starting up a new school. This means that the non-state schools rather, are generally unable to respond to changes in demand for education, which often is a result of changing gang boundaries or other conflict dynamics. Third, when we talk with school level respondents, so teachers, parents, and school directors, these actors felt that their schools created a strong sense of community. Several of these respondents said that their schools felt like a family, and that parents and teachers also expressed that teachers had a high level of commitment to schools and to the students. This sense of community even extended to gang members. At one school, we found that gang members who attended the same school as children sent their own children to that school. They maintained respect for that school and a level of dedication to it, and they wanted to see that school protected. However, these non-state schools, while having lower fees, they were not affordable to, or rather, they were not accessible to all who might wish to attend them. Many of the non-state schools created exclusive student bodies using entry requirements that often create minimum academic standards, effectively excluding low-scoring students. Most students also have behavioral and dress standards, and these requirements contribute to a school's sense of community, but also exclude certain types of students. The schools that we sampled didn't have problems with gang members within the schools, interestingly, either because they effectively excluded gang members from enrollment or because gang members attending the schools were well behaved. Teachers and directors in several schools readily admitted that gang members were enrolled in their schools, but they didn't want to draw attention to themselves, and so were generally well behaved. In one interesting case, we found that a teacher described one student who initially earned poor grades and sometimes behaved badly, but upon joining a gang, his grades and behavior improved because the gang wanted him to attend college and become a lawyer for the gang. When we asked parents why they sent their children to non-state schools, almost universally, the first answer was for security. Parents feel that non-state schools create a safe environment for education, in stark contrast to government schools. This is a reflection both of school management, which parents feel is more effective in non-state schools, and also a reflection of infrastructure. Non-state schools have gates and fences and smaller grounds, controlling entry to the school and making it easier to supervise students. This often isn't true for government schools. Parents also reference that government schools are required to enroll anyone, while private schools are more controlled or exclusive. We also learned that gangs hold religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, in high esteem, and are more hesitant to interfere with schools operated by these churches. Parents also expressed that they chose non-state schools because they offer a values-oriented education, have a stronger sense of community, and they offer supplemental programming such as English and computer classes. Interestingly, few parents describe school quality in terms of grades or performance on tests. Parents also expressed that teachers in private schools are more dedicated, responsible, and hardworking than teachers from government schools, which some parents attributed to the differing incentive structures. Teachers at non-state schools can be fired if their performance is lacking, but government teachers have much higher job security, are paid much better, and they're consequently seen as complacent sometimes. Our study found that violence and insecurity impose additional supply and demand side costs to education. Non-state schools invest in security through gates, security guards, and security cameras, which inflate operational costs. And some schools are also extorted by gangs. And these additional costs are passed down to the households who choose to attend these schools. Parents pay for private transportation or escort their children to school to ensure that they arrive safely and avoid the dangers associated with crossing gang boundaries or just being in the street. They also pay to attend private schools when they could otherwise attend government schools for free or nominal costs. We found that universally private schools have higher costs than government schools, which are officially fee-free. While many non-state schools could be considered affordable to families at the poverty line, the greatest concentration of schools charge $20 to $30 per month, which is inaccessible to the poorest Salvadorian families. The government also provides free books, uniforms, food, and shoes to schools and government schools, but these costs must be covered by students who attend private schools. However, it's important to note that government schools aren't cost-free. One parent said that they determined that it would be cheaper for their child to walk to attend the nearby private school and pay a small monthly fee than to pay for public transportation to attend the closest government school. So from here, Arjun's going to discuss some of the findings from the case study in Kaduna State in northern Nigeria.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert, for that presentation. So I wanted to begin with describing the context of violence in Kaduna State. The nature of conflict and violence in Kaduna is complex and multifaceted. It includes political, religious, communal, gender-based, tribal, and ethnic-based violence. And these forms of violence often interlink and rarely occur in isolation. Clashes between farmers and herdsmen, for example, are based on a deep-rooted mistrust along tribal and religious lines. And education in Kaduna takes place within this complex state of conflict. And as a representation of the cultural profile of the community, schools are often at the center or caught in the crossfire of conflict. We've seen that some of the long-term impact of violence on education includes migration of teachers to safer communities, increased school dropouts, and segregation of schooling across tribal and religious lines. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to also describe sort of the map of the non-state sector in Kaduna State. And in Kaduna, the non-state sector is dominated by three types of providers: Islamic, integrated Islamic, and non-Islamic, which are usually Christian providers. According to data from the General Household Survey, 18% of students are enrolled in non-state schools in Kaduna State. The majority of non-state schools are either Islamic or Christian, and it is important to note that formal, religiously affiliated non-state schools that incorporate the basic education curriculum are considered private by the Kaduna State government. In Kaduna, there are two broad types of Islamic schools: Sangayas or Quranic schools, also referenced as madrasas in other countries, and Islamia schools. Sangayas are non-formal, mobile institutions that revolve around a ma'alim, a spiritual leader. Sangayas remain popular among the lowest income groups, and it is estimated that 4/5 of the out-of-school children in northern Nigeria attend some form of religious education, including the Sangayas. The children that attend the Sangayas are called the Almajri. These children are typically sent by their caregivers, often from very low-income backgrounds, to live and study in the Sangayas. Non-integrated Sangayas offer just the pure memorization of the Quran. Islamia schools follow a more formal structure, and they can either be integrated or non-integrated. Integrated schools offer the national basic education curriculum alongside an Islamic education, and these remain popular across Kaduna. Christian and Islamia schools account for most of the formal non-state schools in Kaduna. So moving on to the next slide. Like El Salvador, we sort of organized findings under 4 broad themes. The first is accountability, the second is access and equitable inclusion, the third is quality, safety, and holistic well-being, and the fourth is education, finance, and sustainability. So the first finding under accountability is that we noticed that state authorities recognize the complementary role of non-state schools in Kaduna, but they are largely unaware of the specific needs and conditions of these schools. Government actors who we interviewed broadly agreed that the non-state schools play a significant role in education. State actors were honest about the shortfalls of public education, citing overcrowded classes, lack of space, and a general lack of accessibility to public schools. Despite this recognition, government officials are largely unaware of the precise needs and conditions of the non-state schools. This is due partly to the lack of robust data available on these non-state schools. The private school board, which is in charge of registration, monitoring, and evaluation, have around 34 field staff responsible for the inspection of nearly 2,240 registered schools, which is around a ratio of 1 staff member per 65 registered schools. There are obviously a lot unregistered schools that go unnoticed by the government. Our second finding is that state policies on registration, accreditation, and taxation of non-state schools are described by our interviewees as unclear and burdensome. We were told during school visits that the registration and accreditation process in Kaduna State has multiple phases and criteria that were unclear and time-consuming for most of the non-state schools. For all the 3 registered schools that stated that there were many multiple government taxes, which were a heavy burden on their finances. The largest of these fees is the annual reaccreditation fee, which can typically range from $97 to over $500. And to put things into perspective, almost all our schools charge sort of a term fee of around $10 or less. In addition to the annual reaccreditation fee, schools are subject to various fees that are not consistently applied by the government or not clearly understood by all schools. Head teachers and school directors gave inconsistent statements as to the types of fees they were charged. This includes local government tax, land rental fees, commerce, industry, and appropriate signage fees. The third finding under accountability is that non-state schools are deeply rooted in their communities, and as a result, parents, teachers, and headmasters are extensively involved in ensuring the well-being of the school. Islamic schools, whether Islamia or Sangaya, are deeply rooted in their local communities. Parents describe non-state schools as family, where relationships between teachers, parents, and headmasters extended beyond school walls. And as a result, non-state schools are often managed by the community or have an active parent-teacher association involved in school operations and decision-making. Beyond school management, schools receive in-kind or financial support from the local communities. Parents provide material goods such as mats, chalk, and teaching materials. They also give monetary donations or offer services such as volunteer support for school feeding. Wealthy community members also provide donations as part of the Islamic practice of wakaf. For Islamic schools, these donations are a crucial source of revenue, without which they would struggle to stay afloat. The Sangayas that we interviewed, we found were also willing to partner with state authorities and to integrate basic education into the curricula. However, we found that they were slightly disappointed by the lack of commitment showed by the state government in engaging meaningfully with the non-state sector. So Kaduna State has benefited from 2 pilots to integrate basic education into religious non-education schools. The federal government integration scheme, which started in 2006, sought to build integrated Sangaya schools around the country to address the growing Al-Majri and out-of-school populations. The second pilot was part of the Education Sector Support Program in Nigeria, ESPN, a large multi-year engagement program sponsored by DFID. And following its success in Kano State, ESPN moved to Kaduna to replicate the Islamia, Quranic, and Sangaya education, also known as IQTE, integration program. The program's success was built on sensitizing communities on the merits of basic education and explaining that integrating a basic education curriculum into an Islamic school did not mean removing the religious component. So due to these pilots and various other efforts, the Ma'alams and communities that we interviewed have come to accept and acknowledge the importance of basic education. However, the end of the ESPN and the government's failure to sustain the pilot integration programs have somewhat frustrated the Ma'alams and communities that have embraced the concept of integration. So moving on to findings under access and equitable inclusion, we find that the student bodies of these schools are largely of the same religion or tribe, and this sort of reflects the localized and faith-based nature of non-state schools. Although non-state schools do not actively set entry requirements for children from different ethnic or religious backgrounds, the self-selection bias of parents can cause exclusive rather than inclusive student bodies. We found it very rare in Islamia schools to find Christian students as part of the student body. The second finding under access and equitable inclusion is that enrollment in affordable non-state schools is driven not only by religion, but also by the perceived quality of a values education and by school location. So non-state schools are almost universally preferred to secular state schools. All parents who send their children to Islamic non-state schools disclose that their primary motivation for doing so was because the school provides an Islamic education. State schools, which are secular and fee-free, do not teach Islam or any other religion. Cultural affiliations of communities to specific religious schools motivate parents to keep their children in such schools, even if they must pay higher fees. This affiliation to religious teaching is closely linked to the desire for values education, where children are taught discipline and respect for elders and are given lessons on proper ethics. The importance of learning the Quran is particularly important to parents of children attending Sangaya schools. So moving to the next slide. The first finding under quality, safety, and holistic well-being, we found that conflict and violence affect non-state schools in a variety of ways, including the suspension of classes and the loss of infrastructure. Enrollment and attendance rates decrease as parents relocate away from violence-torn locations. Civil unrest and incidents of violence force schools to suspend classes. The amount of time schools suspended classes ranged from a few days to 4 weeks, and these school closures were sometimes enforced by government curfew, and when classes resumed, some parents chose to keep their children at home for an extra few days. According to teachers, the performance of students dropped as a result of missing school. And other anecdotes included the destruction of infrastructure and incidents of school vandalism as a result of conflict and crisis to schools. In the medium to long term, attendance and enrollment rates decrease. Parents relocate out of fear of being targeted for religion, ethnicity, or tribe. And the migration of families adds to the growing homogenization of student bodies. The second finding under this section is non-state schools can respond proactively to conflict or imminent violence because they're rooted in their community network. Non-state schools are not immune to conflict. However, we notice that Islamic non-state schools that are endorsed by local religious leaders enjoy an added level of respect and legitimacy that can protect themselves from violence. Parents and teachers believe that non-state schools provide a safer environment than public schools. And as opposed to public schools, formal non-state schools also are fenced and walled, which significantly improves safety. Some schools often hire security guards to improve safety as well. We also noticed that religious non-state schools have a platform to incorporate ideas such as peace building and civic engagement in their school curriculums. But there's also a fear within the government that unregulated schools can influence violent or extremist behavior. We found that religious non-state schools, however, were found to teach good citizenship, respect for others, and morality, subject closely linked with teachings from the Quran and other religious scripts. As I mentioned earlier, the other hand, there is perception among certain government officials that sangayas can influence violent or extremist behavior. One official expressed sadness and fear for the Al-Maziri by saying most of these children lack parental care and charity. The potential radicalization of Al-Maziri is blamed on fundamentalist malams and the poor quality of education in non-integrated sangayas. In terms of education finance and sustainability, we found that the cost to households of sending their children to non-state schools varies according to school type. Non-integrated Islamic schools tend to be more affordable than Christian and public schools. There are a few data sources on the household cost of education in Kaduna State. Among these is the General Household Survey Panel, a national representative survey that provides broad insights on the household cost of education in Nigeria, including Kaduna State. Analysis by the World Bank revealed that religious non-state schools in Nigeria tend to be more accessible than secular private schools, having overall lower unit costs, which at times are even lower than public school unit costs. Enrollment in the religious schools tends to be slightly higher among children from poorer families, and religious schools and public schools are important providers for the poor. Finally, we found that affordable private schools are generally not profit-driven, and they're often not profitable. Non-state schools depend on monetary or in-kind contributions from the community for financial sustainability. Many private schools are established by teachers, charitable individuals, or religious groups, and all sampled schools in our study were established by a social, not-for-profit mission. The driving motivation for many of these schools is to provide a quality education that is associated with religious values and traditions. While system-level data on school profitability are not available, school directors included in the study stated that their schools were not profitable and they were perpetually short on funds. Head teachers of Islamia schools described how their schools would shut down if they were it not for donations received by wealthy individuals during Islamic and religious festivals. Of all sampled schools, sangayas operate in the most precarious financial circumstances. Sangayas charge zero or minimal fees and rely heavily on subsistence farming, community support, and informal business services. Sangayas often farm on public land for food that is shared with teachers and students. For example, one ma'alam interviewed explained that they offered tailoring or shoe polishing services in order to generate income. And the ma'alams at these sangayas are not paid. So those are our findings from El Salvador and Kaduna State. And now I'll hand it over to my colleague Nick Burnett to go over a summary of findings and describe some of the implementations and recommendations. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Arjun. As he said, I will describe the findings overall and then turn to some recommendations that stem from these two case studies. I myself am a senior fellow here at Results for Development, formerly founded and ran the education group here. I also took part in the El Salvador study. Let us start with the findings. And let me begin with a caveat that these are two case studies from two very different areas. Nonetheless, we should not conclude that findings from these two are necessarily applicable to all conflict and crisis situations. These two, for example, do have functioning states which do provide public education. So there is not a complete collapse of the state in either of these cases, as there may be in some other conflict situations. So we should think of these findings as applicable to these two, as forming a basis for thinking about other situations, but not necessarily as applicable to all situations. First of all, affordable non-state schools are extremely important in education provision in these situations. We saw how some 16% of enrollment in El Salvador is in private schools, and how some 18% in Kaduna is in private schools. We saw also how in heavily conflict-affected areas of El Salvador, even as much as 60% of enrollment can be in non-state schools. Secondly, affordable non-state schools are very often religious in nature. And this can be both positive and negative for the impact of conflict on education. Positive when there are attempts to promote understanding and mitigate the impact of conflict. Negative when there may be differences promoted between different religions which are represented by different schools. Thirdly, and very much in both cases, we saw that governments have very limited awareness of the non-state sector. Typically, those at the top of ministries of education are very unaware of them, and even those actually responsible for their regulation have very incomplete information about non-state schools. Fourthly, we found that parents and other caregivers choose non-state schools over the public, over the government ones, for a variety of reasons, one of which is an important concern for safety. Other reasons, which may apply also in non-conflict situations, include such things as belief that non-state schools promote certain values to which they adhere, promote certain cultures, support their religion, and also very important, are close to where they live. But the important point here is that in these conflict situations, we see that safety is a key concern among those making decisions about where to enroll children. As Arjun just pointed out with regard to Kaduna, but as also applies to El Salvador, the non-state schools tend to be not driven by profit, but rather by a sense of service, a sense of mission towards the education of children. They charge fees, which the parents pay, but these fees do not in general cover the costs of operating these schools. So in different ways, as we saw in both El Salvador and in Kaduna State, the local communities are contributing resources to keep these schools functioning financially. And sustainability, the real challenge for schools is to access to this supplementary finance, supplementary to the fees which they earn. I already mentioned that one of the potential risks of the fact that non-state schools are often religious. We can broaden that finding to say that one of the broader risks of non-state schools is that they may exclude certain students or certain communities. These may be other religions, they may be other cultures, they may be of various types. But this exclusion may promote inequality, may not be good for social cohesion. Finally, what about the impact of conflict on the sustainability of the schools? Well, clearly we have seen in both cases that conflict itself imposes extra costs on the schools, and it can lead to displacement of families and potentially therefore to the loss of enrollment. By contrast, if the schools are perceived as much safer than other schools, conflict can actually increase the demand for non-state schools. So it is difficult to generalize about this and necessary to look at it in the context. And indeed, that is, just to repeat what I said when introducing this slide, that is an important point here, that context is crucially important. What we can say depends not only on the existence of conflict and the existence of non-state schools, but also on the broader political and economic context. I'll now turn to the next slide, which presents some recommendations. And we do this for two categories of stakeholder, governments through their ministries of education, and donors. And we have 9 recommendations. These are based on these 2 case studies and also on a very extensive review of the literature pertaining to education, to the role of non-state schools in conflict situations. That literature review is part of the broader publication, which was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. First of all, what about for ministries of education? And by the way, we assume here that the ministries are at least functioning. And also we assume that the ministries are at least open to engagement with non-state actors. If neither of those situations pertains, then these recommendations would be difficult to follow. First of all, we think it very important and surprisingly absent that ministries map and define the various types of non-state actors and target groups within their country or state. They need much more information than they typically have. So as part of that, we recommend also that they conduct regular surveys and assessments of the non-state schools to help them with their decision-making based upon evidence. We suggest that they integrate thinking and planning for the private sector into their education sector documents and plans. This is extremely rare right now, in large part because of the lack of awareness of what the non-state schools are doing, but also because of the fact that, of course, the public money is going into the generally into the public schools, though there are exceptions, as we saw, such as with the Catholic schools in El Salvador. We recommend that the process of registering and accrediting non-state schools be simple. It is complicated in these cases, and we recommend that it can be simpler, clearer, more streamlined. Finally, I just mentioned that in El Salvador, the Catholic schools are receiving subsidies from the state, but we suggest that it may be important for ministries to think more about targeting subsidies towards particular population groups, those who may be more deprived in relative terms, and to think about different ways of targeting any public financing which may be made available to non-state schools. So those are some recommendations, 5 recommendations for ministries. again, assuming that ministries are basically functioning. What about donors? Well, here we have four related recommendations. First, that they map the opportunities and risks associated with engaging with non-state schools. So this can be linked actually to support such things as supporting ministries in doing some of that. Similarly to supporting ministries and investing in government and other ways to improve data collection about non-state schools. We think that given that both that the schools are not in general fully financially viable, but that still their fees represent a burden for some parents, that donors should think about supporting policies that can lower the financial burden for certain not-for-profit affordable non-state schools. And finally, we suggest that the donors could support champions within the government, champions of non-state schools, where there is political will to do so. Often we find within government pockets of both support for and resistance to the idea of working with non-state schools, and donors may be able to help nudge a bit towards influencing the support for these schools by working with the champions. Again, these recommendations, let me stress, do not necessarily apply to every conflict situation, but are based upon our findings in these two places and also the literature that we have reviewed so far. I'm now going to hand over to Suezan Lee of USAID to talk about next steps.
Yes, thank you, Nick, and Arjun and Robert for the presentation and the recommendations. I'm right now going to just share about where we go from the study and where USAID goes from the study, and I'll tell you some of our own next steps. And then after that, I'd like to just open up and facilitate some questions and answers with you all to hear. I'm sure there's quite a few questions that you all have. So in terms of next steps for USAID, some exciting things are happening for the education sector, and namely that there recently, in September in 2017, an act was passed by Congress, and it was called the Reinforcing Education Accountability in Development Act. It's called the READ Act, simply. And it was passed to say, listen, the U.S. supports international basic education and wants to make sure that all children have access to quality basic education. And in that act, it requires that the U.S. government develop a basic education strategy, which USAID is leading. And so because of this, we're hoping, and we know that this study and other studies that we've had done on non-state actors and schools will feed into this new strategy. In addition, not only does the READ Act require U.S. government basic education strategy, we also are in the process of developing a USAID education strategy. And of course, the findings and the recommendations that are coming out of this report, as well as some other studies that we have done in this area, will feed into that strategy. Secondly, that we are all gearing up to do is that we're developing a set of guidance notes and tools for our more than 45 missions and education programs regarding how our education officers should engage and look at this area, what considerations take place. And on that note, I wanted to note that there's a conceptual framework that we had developed through this study that's very important, and that kind of names out all the factors that's in this non-state area, and particularly in conflict and crisis, and looking at the interactions between. And so we're hoping to set up these tools and guidance notes and training up our education officers in this realm. Thirdly, we plan on engaging key global actors, and we are already engaging key global actors such as Education Cannot Wait, the Global Partnership for Education that USAID is engaged in. We want to incorporate our findings and learnings from this evidence into these public forums. And to improve the non-state schools' operating environments and to increase affordable finances to them, as well as to increase the evidence base. So from that, I'm going to go to the next piece, and that is to open it up for some question and answers. I know many of you, and I want to thank you all for those who have provided some questions ahead of time and allowed us to look at those. I will address some of those questions, as well as those who want to add some questions given this discussion. You could go ahead and put it in the chat box. You could type in any questions that you might have, and we'll spend the next, we have the next 20 minutes on just going over some questions that you all have, and our panel here will answer that. So I'm going to just kick it off with two leading questions before we go into the questions that you have provided, just to open it up. So the first question I have, and I'll give it to both Arjun, Robert, and Nick, to whomever feels comfortable to answer this question. If you could speak right now, we know that in many countries in crisis and conflict, there's a proliferation of non-state schools, and it's due to a very broken government system. And I know that Nick spoke a little bit, but if you could speak more to what are the key risks that you see in engaging this sector, and what are the key opportunities with engaging this sector. So if you could kind of respond to that question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Suezan. Happy to kick this off and then open it up to my colleagues as well to supplement the answer. I think in terms of the risks, I think in any sort of engagement with the non-state sector, as we mentioned, the first step is really to understand the context, to understand the complexity of the conflict or crisis in country or in the state. And I think that will bring to bear and that will bring to the forefront some of the risks associated with potential engagement with non-state schools. To give you an example, I think we have to be very careful about sort of what the symbolism or the what the message could be in engaging with a non-state school if, for example, it presents an idea of a weakened government system, if engagement with non-state sectors shows sort of weakness in the legitimacy or authority of the state. I think that's a potential risk that I think both governments and donors need to address. I think in terms of opportunities, there are many. I think the primary sort of opportunity is really to ensure that children continue to have an education. Education cannot cease, even if crisis and conflict is part of the country or the society. So I think the literature shows that non-state schools have an opportunity to provide access, to provide a continuation of an education. And in many cases, these are also safe spaces that they provide. So those are just a few thoughts. I wonder if others here would like to add on that or mention anything else.
So I'm going to go ahead. Thank you, Arjun, for that. I'm going to go ahead and ask a second question, and before I head and lead some questions that came from our audience. The second question that I have is that given the scarce availability of resources in conflict and crisis context, is a distinction, there's been a whole lot of discussion between for-profit and not-for-profit school an important one to make, given the El Salvador and Nigerian context? And it seems, I mean, just as Nick has pointed out, then a more important distinction that clearly comes out in both El Salvador and Nigeria is the religious affiliation that seems to be typical, seems to have. What type of implications does this have then for both for government and for donors?
That's a really interesting question, and I think first it's important to point out that in these low resource contexts, especially in conflict-affected environments, we didn't see for-profit schools operating. The schools that we interacted with and we observed and also saw in our review of literature were, as Arjun and Nick pointed out, they were principally motivated by social motivation. So they were congregations or NGOs or CSOs or individuals who wanted to start schools to serve marginalized groups. And while they did often they did charge fees in order to maintain operation, they didn't turn profits, and often they were simply not profitable. So it's important to have, I guess, to keep this point in mind that these schools have different operational models than school chains such as Bridge. You also asked a little bit about the religious nature of these schools. Even the schools that weren't officially associated with with churches or congregations, at least in El Salvador, often had some religious and often non-denominational, but still a Christian curriculum. And this is true as well in Nigeria. That most of these non-state schools were associated with churches or with other religious organizations, and we definitely recognize that this could create challenges in having a donor or other funder or the government support these religious institutions. But it is important to note that in this environment, the majority of the schools are associated or affiliated with religious groups.
I might just add to that it's important, I think, to separate analytically schools may adopt a for-profit legal form and those that actually are pursuing profit. So in some cases, it's possible to sort of register a school as a religious non-profit school. In other cases, it's not. And schools which may not be motivated by the pursuit of profit nonetheless adopt the legal structure for registration purposes of for-profit schools. So we need to not just look at how they are registered, but also how they actually operate in practice. Thank you.
That's super helpful. Arjun, did you want to respond to that, or should I go on to the next question? So I think I'll go on to the next question. So so again, thank you for all those that have submitted the questions, and I'm going to go through some of these questions that you've submitted to us through the RSVP. The first question that came up is a good one. It asks, based on your findings, are there any further recommendations for civil society and other local stakeholders, that is, parents, teachers, NGOs, when considering the context where the source of crisis and conflict is actually the government? What are the implications of your findings on local stakeholders? So there's two set of questions, and maybe, Arjun, I'll turn it over to you to respond to that.
Sure. Thanks, Suzanne. I think this Robert might be good first to respond to this, given what he's seen in El Salvador.
Mm-hmm. So then I guess there's a few components of this question, and the first one that I'll address is additional recommendations for local actors, for schools, and for other nonprofits. So as we mentioned in El Salvador, these schools rarely receive support from donors, NGOs, and the government. And as we've seen across these case studies, is that donors and governments and NGOs are generally unaware of I guess the status of these schools, the fact that they're socially motivated, serve low-income populations, are affordable, and are not profitable. We noticed that the schools that did receive support from the government or from NGOs were those that proactively sought it out. And part of that was making known to these actors the fact that these schools were facing resource shortages and were serving low-income or marginalized groups. So a recommendation that we have for schools and for organizations that support these schools is to proactively seek out support from governments, donors, and NGOs, and to make the status known of these schools, to publicize the fact that these schools are not-for-profit, that they serve low-income and marginalized groups, that they're providing a service that's generally affordable, and that they're not profit-seeking or profitable.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think in the case in Kaduna, one thing that we've learned from the pilot programs of integration of the basic education curriculum is that civil society can play a role in sensitizing communities, especially Sangaya schools, about the value of an integrated curriculum. And I think this is done by presenting an argument that including a basic education curriculum does not mean getting rid of a religious education that's so important for communities there in terms of a values education. So there is a role that civil society can play, and we can draw from the lessons of some of the pilots in Kaduna.
And perhaps we could also answer the second half of that question, which was if there are any different dynamics when the government might be the source of the conflict. And one thing that we saw in the literature as well as in the case studies is that there probably won't be significantly different dynamics, given that non-state schools in these contexts operate very independently from the government. These schools receive most of their financial support locally or from NGOs or international NGOs or donors, and they don't rely on the government for support. They often have very little contact with the government, and there's frequently an ambivalent, I guess, feeling from the government to these schools. So we don't suspect that the relationship between or the dynamics of non-state schools would be different when the government is the source of the conflict.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question that came from the RSVP, and then I'm going to ask Cornelia to share some of those questions that participant has placed in the chat box. So the next question I'd like to ask that comes from the audience is, are non-state schools a sustainable solution? And I know Nick was speaking to this, to education access in crisis and conflict situations. That's the first question. And the second part of that question is, what is the implication on access for the existence of non-state schools in conflict and crisis situations?
Thanks, Suezan. Another great set of questions there. I think in terms of sustainability, I think this is a very important question, and I think this links to, it can be linked to phases of conflict in terms of where a country or state stands in terms of the spectrum of conflict. In terms of active crisis and conflict, I think the non-state sector can really provide urgent gap-filling needs to provide education in emergencies. I think the interesting question is during transition, where a country moves from, let's say, a more humanitarian to emergency setting to a more post-conflict sort of fragile setting, and the way non-state schools can integrate and partner with governments to ensure that there is a sense of sustainability in terms of education provision. I think in terms of post-conflict, I think it's very important to have the government also involved. I don't think it is necessarily a good thing if the education sector is being developed by non-state schools without sort of partnerships with the government to ensure that sustainability. I'm curious if Robert or Nick may have thoughts on sustainability as well.
Actually, I do have a response on that. On about in context of conflict and crisis, are non-state schools a sustainable solution? So at USAID, we see in many places that these non-state schools are proliferated, as we all know, when there's war-torn and when the government can supply them. So you have a lot of them. And so they are actually delivering education through NGOs or through these religious affiliated places. What we typically see is then when there's a peace treaty or some peace agreement that happens, then the donors come in with a whole slew of funds, and there's this urgency to provide legitimacy for the government and to just bring in these non-state schools into the fold of government. So I mean, there's some lessons learned that USAID has from these experiences, whether it be from Afghanistan, where if you do it too quickly, because the government does not have yet capacity to absorb these non-state schools, they can't actually deliver them. So there is ways, and USAID has worked in West Africa, particularly Mali, working with the community schools, with the marginalized, and working with the governments. How do you systematically, and it's a process, it doesn't come overnight. That's a huge lesson learned that we do. When the government doesn't have the capacity, it would be good to do it incrementally, and it's not a bad idea to let the non-state schools deliver that education because they have the capacity and the capabilities to do so. So I would say the sustainable solution is to for governments and donors, when they do come in, when there's a peace treaty and there's more stability happening, to kind of systematically think about how do you integrate it, and not necessarily thinking about the government having that response to deliver that education, but providing the oversight and starting getting the data and the information first before sometimes we have these, especially amongst the donors, these ambitious targets of where we think that the government should just quickly take this on, and they really don't have capacity. So let me take and give it to Cornelia. Maybe Cornelia could share some of this question directly is coming from the participants in the chat box.
Sure. Interesting conversation, and we do have some questions coming in. I will say quickly that we have one comment from Noura Ibrahim, just saying that in Nigeria, some of the states, for example, Sokoto and Kano, do have ministries and boards responsible for ANSS in terms of subsidies and monitoring and registration and accreditation. We have another question from Vidya asking, of all the recommendations presented, which one do you think requires the strongest level of political will from the government?
Great. Maybe Arjun could answer the question directly about Nigeria and Kano State, and then I'll leave it to the panel to answer the second question.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thanks, Cornelia. On the point about Sokoto and Nigerian subsidies, that's a great point there as well. There is the private sector board in Kaduna State that's also in charge of mostly registration, monitoring of schools. And I know the SUBEB State Universal Basic Education Board also has a role to sort of oversight to the non-state schools. Those are good points. In terms of Vidya's question about sort of our recommendations and which sort of is sort of requires the highest level of political will from government. I think there are a few, and I think as Nick mentioned, that we're coming from our assumption is that there is sort of a level of functionality of the government and a willingness to sort of engage with the non-state sectors. But I think in terms of the necessary political will, any sort of feasibility of providing any monetary support, I think would require significant political will on the part of government, and this could be in terms of assistance to teacher training, or even monitoring as well, which we've seen in other countries. I think that access to sort of targeted subsidies would require strong political will, as well as sort of integrating the non-state sector planning processes within, let's say, joint education sector reviews or education plans. I think we'll need a fair amount of political will in these situations.
Okay. Should I move to another question, Suezan?
Yes, please do, Cornelia. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. We have one from Pat Krabacher. In the non-state schools, teachers are often paid poorly. What types of stipends or allowances are deemed the best to motivate teacher performance and build safety and resilience in the teacher community? It would be helpful if you could list a few types of stipends and allowances.
I'm going to have and turn this over to Robert, and maybe Nick could speak on that, because I know Robert, specifically in El Salvador, there's quite a bit of discussion we had about the low salaries that the teachers received, and what some kind of recommendations that could help help that situation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and thanks for raising that issue. It's also a really challenging subject to address, primarily because these schools are able to offer such low fees primarily because they pay their teachers so little, often at minimum wage and while providing little to no benefits, in contrast to teachers who are public sector employees and receive rather elevated salaries. A lot of the and this is an interesting issue because it contrasts with the point that teachers at these affordable non-state schools are often perceived as being more dedicated, and this is largely a result of, or perceived to be a result of their limited job security compared to the job security of public sector teachers. We didn't hear a lot of I guess innovations coming from non-state schools and providing teachers these with different, I guess, models of stipends, but we did see that teachers were attracted to teaching at these schools because of many of the same reasons that students were attracted to teaching at non-state schools, primarily because the schools were seen as safer, they had a stronger sense of community, and they might have also been closer to where teachers were living. Teachers face many of the same challenges with security in these same environments as the students face as well. I'd like to see if Nick has any other comments on the subject.
I think it's interesting to link that question to the other questions about how you might provide some sort of limited subsidies to non-state schools. So, as we discussed before, you could target subsidies on certain population groups, deprived populations, disadvantaged populations. You could support schools, non-state schools in general, or as we saw with the Catholic schools in El Salvador, you the public support is essentially coming by the state paying at least some of the teachers, maybe more. I think a bit. I can't quite remember it, but more than half, I think, roughly. So there are different ways in which this could be done, which could be related, which could be used if you wanted to try to influence the remuneration and conditions of teachers. The way you provide a subsidy could be one mechanism for getting at that question.
Yeah, in fact, let me give some country examples that we've done this. And so at USAID, so when we had a relationship with Mali, with the community schools, we negotiated with the government because the teacher salaries were covered by the communities, that the Mali government would pay for the teacher salaries for these community teachers. So that was one example. Another example that we recently, a lot of countries, and East Asia is a great example of this, is that many times when you come out of a war-torn countries, the governments just don't have the budget envelopes to provide the teacher salaries. And so, but once they start, the economic gets better and improves and they have more of a tax base, then like places like South Korea, they'll then take on and pay the teacher's salary, and they'll do it in like a percentage, to take over it. So back in Mali, they're experiencing the same situation at the secondary level where they can't provide, the schooling. So, but there's a lot of non-state schools. So what they're doing is covering teacher salaries at the secondary level to provide secondary schools. So there's various examples right now, and I think that is kind of the going trend, actually. I know Uganda, the ministry has a whole, in terms at the secondary level where it's more costly and they don't have the budget envelopes, they're looking and they have a law that's out on public-private partnerships for that very piece, yeah. Cornelia, can I turn it to maybe one last question, and then I'll close out the session.
Okay, there are lots of questions, so it's a bit hard to choose. I'll just take the next one in the queue. This one is from Ash Hartwell, and he asks, how can donors avoid the risk that they would be seen to align and support sectarian, religious, or anti-state agendas?
That's an excellent question. I'm glad Ash asked that. So I'm going to turn it over to maybe any of the panelists who would like to respond to that. Maybe Nick, you want to take a first stab at it?
Thank you, Ash, for that question. I think it's an interesting one, and this I can't help but sort of refer back to the conceptual framework that we developed, which goes into sort of the thinking about how to engage, how governments and donors could engage with the affordable non-state school sector. And in this conceptual framework, which we present in our report, there is a section that describes sort of the ways in which one should go about thinking about the sort of the comparative advantages as well as the harms that affordable non-state schools could have on certain education outcomes such as accountability, finance sustainability, access, and so on. And I think for us, I think that is the most important component whenever there is engagement with this sector. We have to look at both the comparative advantages as well as the harms. And some of the harms could really be exclusionary enrollment, harmful parallel systems that could develop, radicalization, and so on. But I think the government, to ensure that these harms don't sort of take place, really needs to begin with an understanding of the sector, understanding sort of who the non-state actors are, where are they coming from, what their motivations are, and to really make sure that the government is well positioned not to promote or be part of some of these potential harmful outcomes. And a lot of this could be sort of unforeseen, but I think to minimize that, it really is to understand sort of the context in which state and non-state schools operate, sort of barriers to education, sort of understanding the approaches that ANSS use to overcome the effects of crisis and conflict, and then understanding how governments could be positioned to engage with the sector. I think that's a very broad sort of answer, but I think it begins to present a way to think about engaging the non-state sector, especially in such a sensitive and context.
That's a very good, and I think maybe on the USAID side, I could respond to that question, because that's very much on our mind. That you said none of our funds would ever support some extremist group, and so we do have some clear kind of regulations surrounding directions and guidance regarding our engagement with that. And of course, we have a list of areas of things and considerations, and that's why this whole piece of assessment is really critical. We cannot, at USAID, we cannot target one religious group. We do not do that. We're looking at all schools, and we're not looking at spurring on or giving any favoritism to one group. And it's really important. We can't support, we won't fund anything religious, directly religious curriculum per se, but we could, of course, support on the regular general education front. So we do have a clear clause, what we call the establishment clause, that, and we have all legal counsel that helps us in this area. And I think for that reason, this whole piece of mapping, the piece of assessment is really critical. But yet, just because this is an issue to avoid it does not make sense, because oftentimes, as we all know, education is oftentimes religiously affiliated. It's very personal and it's community driven. So for us to not address this would not be, we won't meet our SDG goals, Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's just one response. I'm gonna, I wanna just first thank everyone, thank the panelists, thank Nina and Cornelia, ECCN, for joining us, and thank for all the participants. And I want to just leave with you all some really exciting reports. I think this is the only report out there that really marries the non-state schools and kind of the conflict and crisis lens. And so I want to share with you some of the reports that are available, a blog that's available, as well as within 5 days, this webcast for those friends who weren't able to participate, that we'll have the recording and the webcast available within 5 days. So if you go to the ECCN network, ECCNnetwork.net site, you can access our blog, you'll access our full report. And I want to just reiterate here about the conceptual framework, and that because there's a lack of evidence in this work, we would really hope to facilitate and spur on those researchers out there to look at this sector. And if you all could look at the conceptual framework, and we would love your feedback on whether it's useful, what needs to be tweaked in it, what needs to be changed in it, so that we have a helpful conceptual framework as we look into this a sector that is increasingly growing due to all the conflict countries and contexts that's burgeoning, unfortunately. So I just I'll close it out here, and I just want to thank everyone. And if you have any questions, just feel free to tell us on the ECCN.net. All right. Thanks.
One quick thing. Sorry, Suezan. For those of you who did ask questions, those are duly noted, and we will do our best to answer those questions on the events page So check back in about a day or so, and hopefully we'll be able to address any questions or comments that you shared with us. We wouldn't want you to feel like we weren't acknowledging. We appreciate everyone's thinking. So sorry to interrupt, Suezan. Just wanted to make that note.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.